Good day all. This talk is an introduction to sociology. Sociology is the study of society. The strange thing about sociology is that people have always tried to understand the societies they lived in, and yet sociology is one of the youngest of academic disciplines, only coming into existence in the 19th century. In this talk, I shall look at how sociology has evolved. I shall cover the history of sociology, including the big names in the field, and I shall also cover the main theories and theoretical concepts which they've developed to try to explain how society works. I shall demonstrate that 4 main theoretical traditions have emerged in sociology. These traditions are examined at greater length in the other 4 talks in the theory playlist. This talk will bring together in summary form the material presented in those talks and will examine sociological theory as a whole. The systematic study of society began with the philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome, and so the study of society was originally a branch of philosophy. Through the Middle Ages, philosophy was pushed aside by religion, but it made a comeback with the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries and the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. The social aspect of philosophy was developed particularly in France, Germany, and Britain. While other countries did make contributions to social theory, it was these 3 European countries that led the way in transforming philosophy into sociology, and that provided most of the leading figures of classical sociology, which covers the 19th and early 20th centuries. The term sociology was invented by the French theorist Auguste Comte in the early 19th century. Comte was greatly impressed by the advances being made in the natural sciences at the time, particularly physics and biology. He declared that the time had come for the study of society to move beyond philosophy and become a science, the science of sociology. Just as Sir Isaac Newton had established the laws of nature, sociologists would establish the laws that govern the operation of society. They would do so by applying the scientific method, develop a theoretical model, and then test it against the facts. Comte developed sociology's first theoretical model of society by adapting a model from biology. He coined the organic analogy, which simply says that society works like a biological organism. An organism is made up of organs. Each organ performs a specialized function or functions which are necessary for the survival of the organism, and they all have to work together for that survival. Similarly, society is made up of specialized social structures or organizations, each of which performs its own function, and all of which work together for the survival of society as a whole. So, the human body has lungs to breathe air, a heart to pump blood, legs to move you around, and so on, and they all work together for your survival. Similarly, society has businesses to meet our material needs, churches to meet our spiritual needs, the police to provide law and order, and so on. Each structure is specialized, which means that none of them can survive on their own. They all need to work together to survive. Comte's emphasis was on cooperation as the basis of society. His model, which focuses on social structures and the functions they perform, has become the starting point for the structuralist tradition in sociology. However, While Comte developed the first scientific model of society, he neglected the second part of the scientific method. He never tested his model against the facts. He remained what's called an armchair theorist or an ivory tower academic. And so, among other problems, he overestimated social cooperation and underestimated the importance of social conflict. This balance was redressed in the mid-19th century by Herbert Spencer, who was the first English sociologist. Spencer's early work was in biology, and like Comte, he came to see parallels between biology and society. But where Comte's model is balanced and static, Spencer focused on evolution and change over time. He argued that evolution in both nature and society took place through a process of competition between populations. This competition resulted in what Spencer famously called the survival of the fittest. The strong survive and reproduce, while the weak die off. Over time, the species gets stronger or fitter. This is the process which Charles Darwin would later term natural selection. As Darwin's fame spread, Spencer's theories were sometimes referred to as social Darwinism. They included the belief that all social programs should be abolished and the poor and weak should be allowed to die. This position gained some popularity in the 19th century and still has supporters who claim it would, quote, improve the gene pool, unquote. However, as the welfare state was built in the mid-20th century, it was criticized as both immoral and short-sighted. For example, allowing the weak to just die would have deprived us of one of the greatest scientific minds of modern times, Stephen Hawking. He is just one example of how the disabled are now seen as differently abled. But that was not an idea that the 19th century was ready for. Instead, the latter half of the 19th century was largely dominated by the work of a German social theorist who also emphasized social conflict, Karl Marx. Marx began as a student of philosophy, but grew disillusioned with the prevailing philosophical trends and switched to political economy. In the 19th century, politics and economics were taught together on the grounds that you can't understand one without the other, which is a position that I think just about every sociologist would still agree with. Marx's theories therefore focus on politics and economics. Everything else is secondary for him. Now, Marx never called his theory Marxism. He called it materialism. This is because he emphasized the material or objective side of society over the ideal or subjective side. He said that for every individual and every society, physical survival has to be their number one priority. If you don't survive, then nothing else matters. Society ensures its survival through the economy, which provides us with food, shelter, and all of the material necessities of life. This is why the economy is always the most important aspect of society, said Marx, and why all other aspects of society must fit in to the economy. Marx studied history, and he developed a model of social evolution based on economic evolution. Early tribal societies had an economy based on hunting and gathering, or foraging. Each tribe was a family, and so these were societies of sharing and equality. But the invention of agriculture meant that wealth, such as grain, could be accumulated. So, some people became richer and more powerful than others. Agricultural society became divided into two main social classes: aristocracy and peasants. A small, rich, powerful ruling class who controlled politics and the military, and the poor, weak majority of peasant farmers who grew the food. In modern industrial capitalism, these classes have morphed into their industrial equivalents, which Marx termed the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, these days more commonly termed the business class and the working class. Marx believed that a society which allowed a minority to grow immensely wealthy while the majority just barely got by was fundamentally unjust, and that it would be overthrown by a violent revolution. The workers could then recreate the society of equality and community seen in tribal times, eliminating the inequality and oppression that characterizes all class societies. Marx was always a political activist as well as a social theorist. And in the 20th century, revolutions, supposedly in his name, took place in Russia, China, and elsewhere. However, what was supposed to be the dictatorship of the proletariat quickly became the dictatorship of the Communist Party. Instead of having no ruling class, these countries just got a new ruling class. This was a development that Marx did not foresee, and that undermined the legitimacy of his model for many people. The late 19th century saw the emergence of two more German theorists who were close colleagues, Georg Simmel and Max Weber. Both balanced Marx's work by focusing more on the subjective side of society, which was more in line with German philosophy of the time. Simmel's education was in philosophy, while Weber's was in history and the law. Simmel focused on social relations, social types, and social forms, and how they'd been affected by the coming of a society organized around money, which is also a subjective invention. Weber focused on subjective aspects of society, such as religion, status, rationality, and bureaucracy. His methodology of Verstehen, which is German for understanding, was based on the premise that understanding people's motivations was the key to understanding their actions. The late 19th and early 20th centuries also saw the work of French theorist Emile Durkheim. Durkheim built on the work of Auguste Comte, developing a much more sophisticated structuralist model of society, which is still widely studied. Indeed, the last four theorists I've mentioned, Marx, Weber, Simmel, and Durkheim, are generally considered to be the big names in classical sociological theory. In the late 19th century, sociology also came to North America. The first sociology department in North America was established at the University of Chicago in 1892. Most of its early members were attracted from philosophy departments, and together they formed what was called the Chicago School, the first North American school of sociology. Two of its leading figures, Robert Park and W.I. Thomas, were heavily influenced by Simmel, and so the focus of the school was also on the subjective. Some theorists, most notably George Herbert Mead, examined the development of the self-image in the individual, while Park examined the rise of urban culture and neighborhood ethnic subcultures in Chicago. In the 1930s, Herbert Bloomer synthesized the ideas of the Chicago School into a theory he called symbolic interactionism. As the name implies, this approach focuses on how people interact using symbols such as language, gestures, and pictures. The Chicago School dominated US sociology until Talcott Parsons developed structural functionalism at Harvard in the late 30s. Parsons built on the work of Comte and Durkheim, and, as the name implies, his theory sees society as made up of social structures performing specialized functions. Parsons' work was developed most famously by Robert Merton and by Niklas Luhmann in his systems theory. Structural functionalism, in turn, dominated US sociology until it was challenged in the 1960s from several directions. Firstly, in the 50s and 60s, a second Chicago school arose. This included theorists like Irving Goffman, who developed dramaturgical theory, which argued that people play social roles much as actors play theatrical roles, creating different self-images or personas for different roles. Also at Chicago, Howard Becker developed labeling theory, which argued that marginal social groups, or outsiders, are sometimes negatively labeled by authority figures for their own benefit. Their work also inspired Harold Garfinkel to develop ethnomethodology, which focuses on detailed description of everyday life and conversation, establishing the hidden meanings and background assumptions which guide our lives. But meanwhile, the US had also seen an influx of Marxist sociologists in the 30s. 1923 had seen the founding of the Frankfurt Institute in Germany, what today we would call a Marxist think tank, led by theorists like Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. When Hitler came to power in Germany, most of them fled to the US, partly because they were Marxists, whom Hitler hated, and partly because many of them were Jews, who Hitler hated even more. In the US, they quickly learned that Marxism was practically a dirty word. So they changed the name of their approach to critical theory. Critical theory sought to round out Marx's work with a greater emphasis on the subjective, from studies of the authoritarian personality to analyses of how the culture industry, more commonly these days termed the entertainment industry, spreads capitalist ideology and promotes acceptance of the rule of the capitalist or business class. Their critique of the mass media was expanded on in the late 20th century by Noam Chomsky, among others, who called what they do manufacturing consent. By the 60s, Marxist ideas had spread throughout the US, not only entering sociology, but also contributing to the rise of a left-wing counterculture and student protest movements. But the 60s also saw the rise of a social movement which would have an even bigger impact on sociology. What was then called the Women's Liberation Movement, now just the Women's Movement, and its accompanying theory of feminism. Feminist writings have existed since the 18th century, notably Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792. But for a long time, these were lone voices crying in the wilderness. This is because, at that time, only occasional women from well-off families could obtain an education or access to academia. It was only after World War II that large numbers of women gained access to higher education. This led to the creation of a women's intelligentsia, a generation of educated women who forced men to pay attention to them. Feminism emerged as a genuine school of thought in the 60s, led by American theorists like Betty Friedan and Jessie Bernard. After that, there was an explosion of feminist writings in the late 20th century, with the approach splintering into various sub-theories such as liberal feminism, radical feminism, Marxist feminism, and so on. Feminism, of course, provides women's viewpoint and looks at how gender affects society, focusing on issues like gender roles, gender relations, and gender inequality, and providing theoretical support for women's struggle for equal rights. The late 20th century saw both feminism and sociology as a whole become greatly influenced by the school of Post-Modernism. This was led initially by French philosophers such as Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Pierre Bourdieu. Postmodernism evolved from post-structuralism, which, as the name implies, involves a rejection of structuralism in favor of a radical subjectivism. An updated form of relativism, postmodernism proclaims that all truth is relative and that therefore there is not one truth but many truths. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion. Knowledge just consists of language, and language is distorted by social relations of power. Instead, a truly inclusive and democratic society must acknowledge the validity of all viewpoints. Within feminism, Dorothy Smith turned this approach into standpoint theory, arguing for the need to include the standpoints of minority groups, such as women and ethnic minorities. In the 1990s, queer theory emerged, arguing for the need to also include the views of gay and transgender persons, and attempting to move beyond a binary definition of gender. Sociology has existed as a discipline for about 200 years. I have given you a brief history of those 200 years. I would argue that this history shows that sociology has developed through 4 intertwined theories: structuralism, Marxism, subjectivism, and feminism. Each of these theories has deep historical roots, but in the modern era, structuralism began with Auguste Comte in the early 19th century, Marxism began with Karl Marx in the mid-19th century, subjectivism began with Georg Simmel and Max Weber in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and feminism began with Betty Friedan in the mid-20th century. These 4 theories define sociology today. Each of them by now has many sub-theories, but together they cover sociology as a whole. Each approach has its adherents, and there is no shortage of sociologists who will tell you that one of these theories is the right one, and that the others are therefore wrong. But I'm not that kind of sociologist. I believe that each of these approaches focuses on a different aspect of society. This means that each of them asks different questions and so gets different answers. Each of them has something to teach us, but no one of them has all the answers. Only by putting all four theories together can we do justice to sociology and come to an understanding of society as a whole. In the talks that follow, I shall examine these four theories at greater length, and I shall apply them to the analysis of specific aspects of society. As you will see, understanding how society works begins with understanding how sociology's four theories work. For now, that concludes my introduction to how sociology works. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day.